I'd like to welcome you to the debates. As you know, we had the first one last year where we had outside speakers, and we invited 4 people to debate the non-contentious issue about whether American hegemony was a good thing or not, and we've developed a web page. This year, we are doing a student debate, and that was at the behest of some of the students that we have here tonight debating the motion, institutional multiculturalism is detrimental to a liberal arts education. The questions are usually framed in terms of, of multiculturalism, what is multiculturalism and how do we foster it. This is a deliberately provocative motion, which came from the students, by the way. I should point that out, that the students are debating this. And the students are Haley Hugent and Christine Costa for the motion, and Liz Kim and Alma Heckman against the motion. And what I'm just going to say now before I turn it over to Vanessa Arslanian, I wanted to thank, first of all, the participants for doing this, because 3 out of the 4 participants, I think, were writing theses, and we had to agree on the terminology and all of that. It was particularly logistically difficult to do this debate in terms of advertising it the way we did last time. But I wanted to especially thank Vanessa Arslanian, who moderated the debate last time and is moderating again this time, who's played a very instrumental role in this whole conception of these debates, which I'm hoping, at least as a faculty member, will become something that's a regular part of Wellesley's intellectual life. So I want to just say one word. I passed out ballots to most of you. What we'd like to do is, what we did last time is we had a vote before and after. Very simple, straight up, yes or no vote. We had voting before, we had voting after. A lot of people voted before, a lot of people didn't vote after, which, I'm not sure how to explain that exactly. Maybe they just didn't want to vote, or they didn't know how, or they forgot, or because it was a little bit cacophonous at the end, so people were coming and going. So what I'm going to do is, for the first ballot, I'm going to walk around with a box, just take the ballots before the debate, and then afterward, I'll put the other box out there, and you can drop your ballot in at the end. If you have to leave early, you can vote early, I suppose. The only thing you can't do is vote twice, So, okay, so if you have 2 ballots, give one to your next door person. So, all right, so I'll let Vanessa introduce the issue, and then let the speakers debate the motion. Thank you very much for coming. It's a good turnout for the end of the year. Anybody who doesn't have a ballot, I'm going to give them now a ballot.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Vanessa Arslanian, and I'm going to be your moderator tonight for the second installment of the Wellesley Debates. I'd like to welcome you all, and thank you very much for coming. As Professor Cushman mentioned, our 4 debaters tonight will be arguing for and against the motion, institutional multiculturalism is detrimental to a liberal arts education. Before we get started, I think it would be helpful to speak a little bit about what multiculturalism is, and as it will be referenced in the debate. So, multiculturalism as a philosophy advocates the tolerance and celebration of cultural difference and the preservation of culture as a basis for individual identity formation. Multiculturalism resists assimilation into a dominant culture, which in Western societies has predominantly been patriarchal and racially and ethnically homogenous. Multiculturalism has been a leading ideology in higher education since the 1990s, and educational institutions have sought to foster racial and ethnic diversity. Can you not hear me? Hello? Is that a little bit better?
Sorry. I broke it. It's on. It's very soft.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, not at all. Maybe else. Can everyone hear me all right if I speak at this volume? Yeah? Ooh. Okay. So, as I was saying, multiculturalism has been a leading ideology in higher education, and many liberal arts institutions subscribe to the virtues of multiculturalism and integrate their commitment to a multicultural community into their marketing strategy to draw in new applicants. Wellesley is no different. Our website states that multiculturalism at Wellesley is a way of life in addition to being an intellectual pursuit. Yet critics of multiculturalism have argued that institutional settings assume that members of a particular race or ethnic group automatically represent a particular culture when it may not be appropriate to do so. Others argue that stressing difference in institutions creates conflicts among groups. and makes it more difficult for people to think outside of artificially created cultural categories towards some common goals and values. Today, our debaters will examine both the virtues of multiculturalism as an idea and the feasibility for its implementation. Their debate will also raise the question of whether this concept is beneficial for a liberal arts education whose stated mission includes the commitment to community and the open-mindedness necessary to foster academic excellence and civic engagement in its students. So with that foundation, I now move on to the structure of the debate itself. Each team member will give an 8-minute opening argument in alternating order. Ms. Huguet will begin arguing for the motion, Ms. Kim against, Ms. Costa for the motion, and then Ms. Heckman against. One member of each team will then be given 6 minutes to rebut the arguments of the opposing side, with Ms. Huguet rebutting first, followed by Ms. Heckman. Finally, Ms. Kim and then Ms. Costa will have the opportunity to summarize their side's argument for 6 minutes each in the concluding section. I will verbally notify each speaker when they have 1 minute remaining, and when their time has expired, I will alert them via gavel, like so. Courtesy of President Bottomley, thank you very much. And afterwards, we'll have a 20-minute question and answer session, and I'll go over those guidelines once we get there. So with that, I'd like to invite Ms. Huguet to give her opening statement.
Thank you, Vanessa. Oh, hi. The object of my position, can everyone hear me? Fine, okay. The object of my position is to illustrate that institutional multiculturalism is detrimental to a liberal arts education by highlighting the tension between the mission of liberal arts education and institutional multiculturalism. But before I do this, I think it necessary to draw a distinction upon which both Christina and I will rely between institutional multiculturalism and diversity, so that we may clarify that our critique of multiculturalism is not simultaneously a critique of diversity. Diversity is, for us, and also for the academic literature that we reviewed, distinct from institutional multiculturalism, in that diversity simply describes a demographic condition of variety within an institution. Diversity can greatly enrich the intellectual vibrancy of a liberal arts institution by contributing to the variety of ideas in an academic environment. This is one place in which I agree with Wellesley's admissions literature, which reads, Wellesley understands that a diversity of viewpoints is a necessary precondition for educational vitality. Identity and experience, including racial and ethnic backgrounds, are important sources of the viewpoint diversity that enhances learning in a community of inquiry. I take this claim to be unproblematic. Having a variety of viewpoints in a liberal arts institution is certainly beneficial for fostering a more vibrant dialogue. Institutional multiculturalism, by contrast, is an ideology, not a demographic state, that advocates, as Vanessa mentions, the tolerance and celebration of cultural difference, and the preservation of culture as a model for individuals' identities. In this sense, institutions profess multiculturalism as a philosophy, as a means by which to structure and define the demographic fact of diversity. I will argue that, defined in this capacity, multiculturalism is undesirable within a liberal arts institution and poses a threat to what is commonly regarded to be the mission of a liberal arts education. In doing this, it will first help to define what exactly we mean by a liberal arts education or a mission. One author wrote that in a liberal arts college, learning is collaborative rather than competitive, values are central, there's a strong sense of community, and the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. Other authors define the liberal arts college in a similar fashion, as institutions where critically thinking, rational individuals form a strong community united by an objective search for truth and knowledge. Liberal thinking, whose authority is reason and not experience, can give students the ability to, as the scholar Martha Nussbaum wrote, call their minds their own. By transcending the subjectivity of personal experience and promoting an idea of community based upon reason, objectivity, and a collective search for truth, this overarching liberal arts mission can help students and faculty bridge their varied cultural backgrounds to form a community founded not exclusively upon social or cultural ties, but upon vigorous intellectual inquiry. In this sense, knowledge and truth are universal aims among those coming together in a liberal arts context. Indeed, it is in the spirit of a liberal arts education that we are currently holding this debate, to foster an exchange of ideas in a community of intellectuals. While, as I mentioned before, the fact of diversity can enhance this mission, explicitly adopting a multicultural framework, as Wellesley does, undermines it. A multicultural framework, which seeks to uphold cultural difference and preserve culture as a model for individual identity, makes it more difficult for students to think outside of established cultural categories and search for more common values in a community of intellectual inquiry. For example, while having students from a variety of social and academic backgrounds in a seminar can enhance the intellectual atmosphere by adding to viewpoint diversity, a seminar with people from a variety of backgrounds, where it is assumed that they will operate as representatives of their particular backgrounds, is reductive, insofar as it relegates students into particular categories and restricts intellectual freedom of movement. This is the essential difference between diversity and institutional multiculturalism. The former expands the possibilities of academic inquiry, while the latter delimits those possibilities through the maintenance of cultural categories established by an institution. So, in a multicultural framework, identity is not simply a tool of intellectual inquiry, but a goal of inquiry itself. Intellectual investigation is used as a tool to affirm, preserve, and celebrate cultural categories, but cannot question the relevance and meaning of those very categories under which it operates. This is problematic, because it is in the spirit of a liberal arts education to ask questions about how to define culture, whether culture is a meaningful category, and what roles it plays in shaping individual identity. Yet multiculturalism, contra this spirit, assumes answers to these questions, asserting that culture can be clearly defined, that it is a meaningful category, and that it is a valuable framework by which to shape individual identity. In other words, when we accept a multicultural framework, we also accept assumptions about what culture is and what it means. These assumptions, when pervasive in an institution, stifle intellectual inquiry on the subject of culture. They can lead to the fossilization of cultural categories and the essentialization of other cultures as irreducibly different. In this way, a multicultural framework defines culture as a concept that is not complex and fluid, but simple and fixed. This is why institutional multiculturalism is undesirable within a liberal arts context. It demarcates the parameters of intellectual investigation, when that investigation should, theoretically, be boundless.
Thank you, Ms. Edith. I now invite Ms. Kim to make her opening statement.
Can everyone hear me? No. Now can everyone hear me? All right. Good evening. Alma and I will be defending, or rather going against the motion, arguing that institutional multiculturalism is in fact both necessary and beneficial to a liberal arts education. To begin, there are a plurality of experiences and identities that we as students come with to each college campus. Liberal arts campuses across the country no longer can understand their communities to be bound only by the standards of young white men, which is traditionally what defined the goals of a liberal education. I think that while our opponents have argued that a liberal education has particular goals, they have kind of described these goals in an ahistorical context. That is, they haven't really explained what it is that an, quote, objective search for truth really constitutes. Our experiences provide the social location from which we both experience the world and how we criticize the knowledge that we come into contact with. That is, that your experience based in race, socio-political experiences determine how it is that you both understand truth and what you think truth might be. A liberal education is intended to produce individuals that are capable of both self-reflection and self-actualization. That is, it's at this juncture that institutional multiculturalism becomes valuable. Haley emphasized the need for diversity as opposed to multiculturalism, but this distinction doesn't make very much sense, given that multiculturalism is the ideology and the foundation that makes each viewpoint valuable. That is, saying that having a multiplicity of viewpoints is valuable for fostering discussion cannot be separated from the larger question of what kind of practices we use to make those viewpoints accessible to everyone and to create a community in which individuals feel free to speak their minds and to speak from the position of which they've come. Before engaging in the issue of institutional multiculturalism as it's practiced and conceptualized today, it's kind of important to go back and understand where it is that liberal education has come from. More specifically, understanding why institutional multiculturalism was embraced in the first place explains why many of the problems of institutional multiculturalism that Christina and Haley may identify are somewhat detached from the larger historical context in which we began to use multiculturalism as a tool to begin with. First, liberal education was predicated on the privileging of certain knowledges. That is, there was an understanding that there was a rational and objective truth, that Western understandings of the canon of great literature, science, and history, and the humanities were all privileged to a certain degree. In contrast to this understanding, multiculturalism privileges group identifications. It privileges a contextual truth, the idea that your experience of a particular truth, or truth claim rather, is different than someone else's predicated on, let's say, your race. But liberal education claimed that knowledge was context neutral, that it was internally coherent, and that it was absolute. This established the goals and the overall atmosphere of the liberal arts community until the 80s and 90s, when there was a sudden influx of students who were women, who were people of color, or other forms of minorities. It was in reaction to the sudden change in composition of student bodies that institutional multiculturalism really entered the debate about what it meant to have a specific practice that attempted to engender a feeling of community within colleges. In reaction to this shift, it catalyzed this institutional multiculturalism, which was a response to the need to balance both an affirmation of difference in identity, as well as the overarching goal of a liberal arts education, which is to foster community. When we think about community now, we assume that there is kind of a group of people that feel free to participate and to deliberate across ideas, across different barriers, whether they be our different experiences. But these barriers exist because of the different kinds of cultures that we encounter. Nowadays, we take such critical thinking and such community for granted. We assume that all truth claims are suspect. We presume that knowledge is created through positions of power and that we can criticize them. But this type of critical thinking really isn't possible outside of an institutional multicultural context. As we are all well aware, institutionalizing multiculturalism at Wellesley College has taken several different forms. We have the multicultural requirement, we have different student organizations, cultural shows, we have cultural studies and ethnic studies here. But more so than just these individual examples of what institutional multiculturalism at Wellesley College is, institutionalizing multiculturalism is the college itself telling both the faculty and the students and the staff, as well as the wider academic world, that we place particular value in the ability of individuals to have experiential knowledge. That is, all of our experiences are important both to the, quote, larger search for truth within a liberal arts college, as well as how we communicate with each other. Our opponents have argued that institutional standards have had the reverse effect. That is, they have fossilized and essentialized cultures, but frankly speaking, I think they're wrong. Christina and Haley's arguments rely upon a flawed understanding of what community is and how you foster a community. Community is not just about viewpoint diversity. It's about fostering diversity in such a way that individuals can be self-critical. That is, expanding your understanding of what knowledge is and of what certain experiences mean is important, not just to understanding your own identity, but the identity of other people. Two professors actually sum this argument pretty nicely by saying that communities are educative only if they encourage, support, and provide the means for deliberate communication of both shared interests and challenges to those interests. Institutional multiculturalism works because it ensures active participation by students in the discovery of commonality. Saying that we affirm difference is not synonymous with denying the existence of commonality. We can both look for a shared interest, shared understandings of the world, while not denying the fact that we all have our own certain experiences and truths and knowledge that inform our perspective on things like morality or politics. Recognizing the value of the experiential enhances rather than detracts from the overarching goals of education, which is the pursuit of knowledge. To clarify, multiculturalism, yes, is not just about diversity statistics, but rather it's about establishing the spaces necessary to discuss and discover common goals. One such example is Culture Shock, which was a program that was taken up by college government. It both physically created the space necessary for students to engage with one another and to discuss issues that were considered sensitive. That is, they really pushed at the boundaries of what culture meant. And so in this way, it proves that there was no essentialization occurring, there was no fossilization or acceptance of culture as one such overarching norm, but rather students were invited to question each other, to criticize and to defend their opinions, and to really push at the boundaries of what it meant to have certain experiences based on race, class, gender, etc. This is not to say that all attempts at promoting multiculturalism have been successful. While some may argue that we can separate institutional multiculturalism from the theory of multiculturalism itself, it's very difficult to imagine a viable alternative. That is, if our opponents are correct, if multiculturalism in and of itself is not a desirable option for liberal arts education, what is the alternative? Is there any other ideology or practice that can really foster the community necessary to allow for individuals to both accept that their identities have intrinsic value, but to also understand that their opponents or their peers' experiences are also intrinsically valuable? I have no idea what that says. I think one last thing to kind of keep in mind while we're discussing this is that multiculturalism in general, while you may not agree that all cultures have intrinsic value, to say that it's important to value someone else's culture is not the same thing as saying that every culture is intrinsically good. That is that, yes, we may have differences over certain cultural practices or about certain beliefs when it comes to our identity politics, but that does not preclude the need for a space and a forum that is an institutionalization of the practices that make it possible for us to have those debates to begin with. Thank you.
I now invite Ms. Costa to make her opening statement.
Good evening, everyone. The terms of this debate necessitate two levels of discussion. First, an examination of whether multiculturalism is theoretically defensible, and second, whether it's institutionally viable as a guiding practice. We've established in our first opening statement, or at least attempted to, that multiculturalism is theoretically indefensible. However, the fact remains that most institutions of higher education, including Wellesley College, have dedicated themselves to an explicitly multicultural mission. Task forces have been established, administrative and student positions have been created, funding has been doled out among organizations, requirements have been instituted. It is my task to question whether measures of this nature are generally successful. Multiculturalism is theoretically indefensible in a liberal arts setting in particular. As Haley established, the static, rigid categories necessitated by a multicultural mission undermine the purpose of a liberal arts education, which is to continually question and debate values and ideas. The implementation of programs aimed at achieving an explicitly multicultural aim is equally problematic. In addition to undermining the ostensible purpose of a liberal arts college on a theoretical level, there are three arguments that I'd like to put forth for you tonight. The dedication to a multicultural mission creates a resource struggle among organizations. It creates an institutional reluctance to allow non-traditional but perhaps valid identity groups to claim distinct cultures for themselves, and it tokenizes and essentializes distinct cultural groups. I'll consider each of these claims, and in doing so will include examples from our collective experience as Wellesley students to illustrate my points. The first of these points are not necessarily problems specific to multiculturalism, but are rather problems which arise whenever groups with different sets of interests are put in competition with one another in a bureaucratic setting. This behavior arises regardless of the explicit purpose of the groups, but it is a behavior which is particularly obvious and egregious with cultural organizations. Most people incorrectly believe that multiculturalism is a belief system aimed at increased understanding between cultural groups and individuals of diverse backgrounds. However, as Haley established, multiculturalism actually leads to a fossilization of culture, to stasis, and to a general unwillingness to change. Bureaucracies, too, are famously unwilling to change and difficult to overcome organizationally. It's a phenomenon which has been commented upon by Carl Schmitt, Hannah Arendt, Michel Foucault, among others. This is a dangerous combination, one masked by the hollow rhetoric of progress and understanding espoused by multiculturalists. That multiculturalism lends itself to a competition for resources among student organizations should be a fairly obvious point. Institutional resources are finite. Cultural organizations have a vested interest in representing the obstacles they face as being particularly egregious, or worse in some quantifiable sense than those faced by other groups. We've seen this occur multiple times in at least the last 4 years in various Wellesley forums, and a particularly heated series of community threads gave rise to the college government culture shock panels that Liz points out. Liz championed these panels. While they may be interesting, their benefits are questionable at best beyond making everyone feel accepted and accepting without actually pushing any established boundaries. Whether it is public or admitted, the competition for resources and for the legitimation and recognition of group hardship is real, and to pretend otherwise seems an oversight. There are two problems when this phenomenon occurs. First, it's simply counterproductive, morally problematic, and argumentatively unhelpful to rank hardships or prejudices faced by one group over another. Second, the competition for resources among cultural organizations diverts funds and other resources away from broader community-wide initiatives and organizations which may better serve the liberal arts mission, as established in our first series of arguments. A second problem presented by institutionalized multiculturalism is an established reluctance to allow non-traditional identity groups to form under the umbrella of culture. The reasons for this reluctance are much the same as those we find when we consider the competition for resources engendered by multicultural missions. Cultural organizations have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Much as in the first problem I raised, we've seen actual manifestations of this interest recently here at Wellesley, as when the 2009-2010 candidate for Multicultural Affairs Coordinator, a campus-wide CG position, asserted that socioeconomic status is, quote, more of a condition than a culture, end quote, in response to a question about representing the interests of low-income students. This claim makes it seem as though the only candidate for MAC was unaware that the campus-wide diversity initiative website includes class under its list of protected categories of students, and that socioeconomic status is really just a politically correct way of talking about the realities of class differences. A similar problem arises concerning institutional support and representation for LGBT students, who are denied a cultural identity on the basis that homosexuals have not historically constituted themselves as an identity group. It is intensely troubling for the efficacy of institutionalized multiculturalism that the effect of creating distinct identity groups not only undermines the community-building mission of the liberal arts college, but also creates and perpetuates the exclusionary practices based on group identities purportedly supported by a multicultural mission. Finally, and perhaps most insidiously, institutional multiculturalism both tokenizes and essentializes minority cultures. By tokenizing, I mean that institutional multiculturalism cements minority cultures permanently into the role of the other, a heterogeneous collection of interest groups that are relegated to the periphery of academic and social inquiry. This is ostensibly in opposition to the purposes of multiculturalism, which include the elevation of historically marginalized social, religious, and ethnic groups to the same level of discourse and respect afforded to Western cultures. However, it's in the interest of multiculturalists to perpetuate their own marginalization, much as it is in the interest of multiculturalists to exclude non-traditional identity groups from achieving the label of culture. Again, this is not behavior that's unique to cultural organizations as such, but rather behavior that is common across all organized groups with a common interest and set of goals. However, again, it is particularly insidious in the instance of institutional multiculturalism because this is the very behavior that multiculturalists claim they are trying to overcome. Tokenizing is perhaps the most obvious way in which multiculturalism is institutionalized, and we see it in our own multicultural requirement. Students of Wellesley College are required to have their class deans sign off on a single course which emphasizes non-Western culture or cross-cultural interaction as evidence of their exposure to the ideology of multiculturalism. Even the physical education requirement is actually more difficult to complete. I skipped a Zumba for the third time this evening. Deeming a one-course requirement determined entirely at this point by the title of the course and not by the course content or the student's effort, sufficient to satisfy a multicultural requirement is the very definition of tokenizing. Multiculturalism, the apparent grand goal of the modern liberal arts institution, the ideology to which our alma mater has dedicated herself, is shown in the end to be a bauble, a trinket, a meaningless little form in a vast collegiate bureaucracy. The essentialization of minority cultures, the whittling down of diverse realms of experience to a few catchphrases and stereotypes, is closely linked with this tendency to tokenize. Again, tokenization and essentialization are diametrically opposed to the stated goals of multiculturalists, but institutionalizing these tendencies allows multiculturalists to continue to make resource demands and prohibits significant cultural or institutional change. Attempts to institutionalize multiculturalism, to put programs and events in place that promote a multicultural ideology, simply fail to accomplish their purported goals. This is in part because of the nature of bureaucratic institutions and interest group politics in general. However, the role of the liberal arts institution is not to be a typical bureaucracy with nameless, faceless functionaries who cannot be held accountable for decisions, nor should it be to endorse the fossilization of cultural categories as a means of dealing with the lived fact of diversity, as occurs when multiculturalism becomes the guiding institutional philosophy.
I agree that it's time to evaluate exactly what it is the role of a university or a liberal arts institution in forming citizens of a given nation and creating a model for which its students to follow. I would argue rather than cementing or fossilizing cultural identities by having a multiplicity of ethnic or cultural groups, these groups now have the opportunity, as a result of the resources doled out by the college, to lobby for power when in the larger national context they might be bereft of power. In this way, the college or the university has the opportunity to correct social problems in a microcosmic setting. Further, the university or college and the liberal arts institution in general has the opportunity to establish what counts as knowledge. In general, it has seemed over a long time, before multiculturalism was in vogue, it was mostly the works of dead white male authors and not too many other minority voices, not too many women's voices that were counted as part of that knowledge. If a liberal arts institution takes it upon itself to establish things such as a multicultural requirement to give out resources to various groups, this institution now has the ability to reevaluate what counts as knowledge and to include a multiplicity of voices that would otherwise be ignored and left out of the national structure. When it comes to anti-multiculturalist statements, they soon seem to fall into the category of reactionary or absurd. It appears to be that groups react to a kind of cultural shock or intellectual protectionism against multiculturalism, or a fear of the breakdown of culture. But all of these claims are pretty nebulous. Who gets to define culture, and at whose expense, and at whose marginalizational cost? The answer to all of the objections that Ms. Costa and Ms. Huguet have raised is, what is the option without multiculturalism? What is it that a liberal arts institution can do in order to rectify social problems without installing some sort of multicultural requirement? There are a number of theories as to how to go about a multicultural curriculum, one of which is to teach students to value cultural differences and to understand the meaning of the cultural concept and to accept others' rights to be different, instead of forcing a student body to assimilate into one identity. Further, a multicultural education promotes competence in multiple cultures, and which culture an individual will draw upon on any given occasion will be determined by the situation, i.e., every student will have to be proficient in multiple cultures in order to negotiate a global multicultural world. So it behooves an institution to prepare its students to deal with such a multicultural world. Given that individuals can and normally do develop competencies in multiple cultures, the question for educators is to how to best create a learning environment that promotes rather than inhibits the acquisition of multicultural competencies. It's simply the reality of the world that it's better to be fluent in multiple cultures rather than just be fluent in your own culture. I'd like to cite actually a Maghrebi thinker, Abdelkabir Khabtibi, and his theory of une pensée autre, which means other thinking. Basically, the idea is that in order to negotiate interpersonally and engage fully with the world, one must be able to think in another fashion, to think in another language, to speak in different languages. This is why Wellesley College and other institutions has things such as the language requirement or the multicultural requirement, a variety of student organization that receives funding. And this also serves to make us all ultimately more competitive in the global market, which is another interest that Wellesley College does have. To respond to Ms. Costa's point about resources, this kind of competition is actually inevitable, regardless of whether there is one religious organization or a different cultural organization, or if it's simply different political parties. There's always a finite amount of resources, and people will always be squabbling over them, totally irrelevant as to what cultural background they come from. To bring this a little bit closer to home, I'd like to talk about our former president, Diana Chapman Walsh, and a 2001 document she wrote about how this kind of thing is done at Wellesley. As we all know, one of Wellesley's mottos is "Women who will make a difference in the world." Diana Chapman Walsh wrote, "As a college dedicated to preparing students of all backgrounds to function as powerful women in increasingly global society, it matters intensely that we cultivate an institutional multiculturalism." She said, "We should emphasize the contribution of diversity, viewpoint diversity, ethnic and racial diversity, cultural diversity to the education of our students, for the development as citizens and women who will make a difference in the world, and to the overall intellectual vitality and excellence of the college." She goes on, "An informed view of the stake we all have, having witnessed the close of the bloodiest century in the world history, in finding some common ground, some tools to coexist on this fragile planet." Basically, our argument is, inevitably, we have come through an incredibly bloody century in which we have seen virtually every ethnic and religious organization at a larger level combat with one another in a very bloody setting. And we have to face the reality that this is a multicultural world, and if we are to produce world leaders, it behooves us to make it such that they are competent in one another's cultures. This has, as many of us have mentioned so far, this has been implemented in a number of different ways here at Wellesley. We have the CWDI, which integrates multiculturalism into the very
living in the residential life of every student here. There's a CWDI representative on every House Council that is there to report on affairs and multicultural issues. We have a plethora of multicultural groups, of cultural shows. We have a multi-faith council. We have various task forces. The college greatly emphasizes study abroad and winter session opportunities, volunteering grants, internships abroad, culture shock, and other college government initiatives, which all serve to underline the importance of maintaining a multicultural community, because frankly, what other option is there? If the institution allows us to retreat within homogenized identities, to prevent us from speaking in languages, to prevent us from speaking to one another in this multicultural setting and breaching these divides, then what other option is there? And the institution, seems to me, would have frankly failed us all.
Thank you, Ms. Heckman. Now we begin our rebuttal period, so I'd like to invite Ms. Huguet to make the rebuttal for her side.
Okay. I'd like to begin by addressing Liz's assertion that our diversity-multiculturalism distinction doesn't make any sense. As I stated earlier, we're in agreement with the fact that diversity is a good thing for a liberal arts institution. What we take issue with is a separate category of institutional multiculturalism, which is the institutional preservation of culture as a model for individuals' identities. Here is why this distinction is critical. Institutional multiculturalism acts in opposition to real diversity. It delimits, as I've mentioned, the categories of identity, and thus recognizes a finite number of cultural groupings, preventing instead the proliferation of cultures, identities, and experiences. It opposes the uniqueness and the plurality of individual experience by relegating students into distinct and rigid identity groups. And so, in a multicultural institution, the real possibilities of diversity are not realized. The unique experience of the individual is subsumed to one that belongs to a specific culture. Liz's assertion that it's like multiculturalism supports community is in this way false. It fragments the community of a liberal arts institution into specific cultures. In that sense, we can acknowledge that individual experiences are valuable in a liberal arts context and relevant to knowledge without actually adopting an institutional multicultural framework or espousing that ideology. The second thing I'd like to address is something that both Liz and Alma brought up. Both of them pointed to why we have institutional multiculturalism and assumed that the reasons we have it or it was instituted are still relevant today. They both brought up that institutional multiculturalism came about to challenge the Western canon, to introduce authors and viewpoints that students would have not normally read. But what multiculturalism does today, in our view, is demarcate those viewpoints as different and essentialize them as other. By having a multicultural requirement, we put those viewpoints into categories of, okay, these are different, and not these are viewpoints relevant to a general study of a subject. For example, to make that more clear, in our vision, a class on medieval philosophy, for example, should include both Thomas Aquinas and Ibn Rushd, an Islamic philosopher from the same period, and not relegate the Islamic philosopher to a separate Islamic philosophy category. The latter is what we would do in an institutional multicultural framework. But our sort of vision, which is to include both philosophers in the same category, allows us to acknowledge difference without espousing institutional multiculturalism.
Sure. Oh, sorry, I thought you were inviting. Okay.
Oh, no.
All right, so Ms. Heckman, you can now give your rebuttal.
Okay, so what Haley just cited would actually still fall under the category of an institutionalized class. Say we set up this medieval philosophy class, and say we had both Ibn Rushd and any other philosopher from the Western canon. This would still be part of an institutionalized decision to create this class as part of expanding our horizons at a liberal arts education institution. So that doesn't seem to follow. The other side still hasn't set up an alternative and hasn't answered the question of what exactly would fill the vacuum if we don't have institutionalized multiculturalism. They argue that doling out resources and supporting different student groups' initiatives and supporting the ability to rectify a power struggle that exists outside of the institution would only cement and fossilize identities or essentialize people or box them in rigidly. This all sounds a little bit, it sounds reactionary, frankly, and it sounds like the same old argument that this would create a fragmentary identity on the Wellesley College campus, that if every group is given a certain amount of resources, we would stick within our own box. We would be able to check off our own boxes very quickly on a form, but would not be able to communicate with one another, when in fact this is just not the case. We have seen there are many different institutionalized forums on this campus for dialogue between different organizations that are just as institutionalized as, say, Hillel's Constitution. There is also a very formal setup for things like multi-faith councils so that Hillel communicates with other religious groups on campus. So it goes both ways. Institutionalized multiculturalism isn't just to set up groups and then to keep them apart. It's to also bring them together. Also, in terms of challenging the Western canon, this is all still true. Without setting up an alternative, once again, how can we assume that a liberal arts institution will prepare its students in order to combat homogenized identities or radicalized identities without this sort of dialogue, without this sort of institutionalized fluorescence of dialogue? It seems that we would fall within a very dangerous, backward, and reactionary vacuum.
Oh, I thought I was second.
Okay. I'm pretty sure you go next, actually, Christina.
Oh, am I first? Okay. Well, thankfully, in answer to Ms. Heckman's assertion that we don't have an alternative, I'm going to offer a rather radical and not exactly reactionary alternative to all of you right now. I'm going to do something fairly presumptuous, and I'm going to anticipate some questions, which may be raised when we open this up to the rest of you, and which Ms. Heckman and Ms. Kim have already raised. And I'm going to predict that at least one of you, and probably more, is itching to ask us if multiculturalism is both theoretically indefensible and impossible to institutionalize effectively. Is there an alternative? It's in answering this question that I wish to draw a very careful but important philosophical distinction, and that is the difference between multiculturalism and pluralism. It's not just a linguistic quibble, but it's an important differentiation between two very, very different concepts. Many multiculturalists and many critics of multiculturalism conflate those two terms in their defenses and critiques, and Ms. Kim and Ms. Heckman have done so this evening in their arguments. However, Haley and I would like to propose to you that it's wrong to take multiculturalism and pluralism as being synonymous with one another, and to further propose that the best way for the liberal arts college to address the lived fact of diversity is to fully realize a fully plural system. Much as diversity is a fact of human existence, so too is plurality. The 20th century political theorist Hannah Arendt recognized pluralism as the basic fact of human life, opening her seminal book, The Human Condition, with a paean to plurality, saying, "Plurality is the condition of human action because we are all the same, that is, human, in such a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who ever lived, lives, or will live." The philosopher Isaiah Berlin phrases the concept in somewhat more familiar terms. "Life may be seen through many windows," Berlin writes, "none of them necessarily clear or opaque, less or more distorting than any of the others." The quote by Berlin, bless you, provides familiar imagery to our generation, as we're consistently urged to see issues through different lenses, and is also invoked by the British author Kenan Malik in his essay critiquing multiculturalism, which was written in 2002. Malik, too, fails to distinguish between multiculturalism and pluralism, beginning his essay with the assertion that belief in pluralism and the multicultural society is so much woven into the fabric of our lives that we rarely stand back to question some of its assumptions. However, multiculturalism is an ideology. Plurality is a fact. Multiculturalism creates rigid categories. Plurality recognizes as many categories of human being as there are human beings in the world. Multiculturalism subsumes individual identity to group identity. Plurality recognizes the primacy of the individual. The two should not be confused with one another. And the fact that we can sit in this room and question the inherent benefits and detriments of multiculturalism shows that at its core, the liberal arts does not ascribe to the ideology of multiculturalism. It's time for us to stop pretending otherwise. Multiculturalism is a failed experiment. In an honest attempt to overcome real historical and institutional prejudices, which Haley and I are making absolutely no effort to deny, multiculturalism has only served to further fossilize and cement another, slightly different series of prejudices. It is a rigid, unflinching, and problematic system that has served to poison student life and failed to achieve its original purpose. We must consider the alternative, which is meeting the lived fact of diversity on its own terms with the lived fact of plurality. The liberal arts institution is actually uniquely suited to enact an explicitly plural system in lieu of an explicitly multicultural system for several reasons. First, liberal arts colleges are generally small, and the student body has a relatively restricted average age range. Liberal arts colleges are full of students of a common level of academic achievement, realizing a very basic common ground. Moreover, we share experiences, classes, tight living quarters, office hours, library desks, cooperatives, dining halls, and social interactions, further confirmation of our basic sameness in an Arendtian sense. Finally, liberal arts education serves to emphasize nonconformity, to urge its students and its faculty to question assumptions and ideas through the very method of Socratic teaching with which we're all so familiar at 9:50 in the morning. I do not know what programs will be proposed by a plural system or a system of plurality. I can't predict that. It's sort of the nature of plurality. I don't know what a system involving students, faculty, staff, and alumni in an honest, open, and frequent discourse will amount in. I don't know how funding will be allocated to organizations, what the calendar will look like, how curriculums would change. I only know that it is time for us to finally meet the lived fact of diversity on its own level, to enact a system that will allow us to meet the challenges of diversity in our institution, our nation, and our world, and to cast aside once and for all the rigid, fixed, unchanging, and totalizing categories placed on all of our shoulders by the ideology of multiculturalism. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Costa. Ms. Taylor, if you'd like to submit a closing statement before you
The difference between pluralism and or diversity and multiculturalism as defined by our opponents is nothing more than a semantic difference. If it is more than a semantic difference, then pluralism doesn't mean anything because, as Christina said, it's a fact. Facts tell us what things look like. That is, they describe the reality. They do not give us a way to interpret what to do with those facts. That is, pluralism can tell us that a certain percentage of students here may come from a certain part of the country. They may tell us that they have a certain race or ethnic background, but what it doesn't tell us is what value we subscribe to that reality. That is, for all their emphasis on why we should recognize difference, there's no second part to that statement, which multiculturalism does answer. Pluralism says there are a plurality of experiences and identities, period. Multiculturalism says there are a plurality of experiences and identities, and those identities have intrinsic value, and the communication of those identities and interaction between a multiplicity of identities is valuable because it allows us to both have self-realization and self-actualization in terms of discovering what our identity is in the context of other individuals, as well as better understanding how other people may understand themselves. We can recognize that multiculturalism is problematic. That's not something that we can't concede without still arguing that institutional multiculturalism is better than the alternative. Pluralism is, I think, a good idea, but again, I don't think pluralism provides a sufficient alternative. That is, what does pluralism tell us about how we should interact with each other? What does pluralism tell us about what value there is to culture, to cross-cultural discussions? All pluralism does is recognize difference. It doesn't give us any indication of whether or not difference is valuable or whether or not we should affirm difference in such a way that we can begin to subscribe specific values to our own cultural experiences. How do we create a community that both has a democratic ethic that is pluralistic and intersubjective, that is one that can subscribe to the belief that pluralism is a good idea, that we should embrace a multiplicity of identities, but then takes the further step of acknowledging a multiplicity of identities is insufficient. I can acknowledge that you have a different identity than I do, but that doesn't mean anything unless I also believe that there's some value in discussing your different perspective of, let's say, a political issue because of your particular background. In the absence of such an ability, I think pretty much all of the goals, all of the progress that we've made as a multicultural institution will have been lost because there's no way for us to understand each other beyond a simple recognition of difference. In fact, it's more likely that underneath a pluralistic framework, I suppose, as I'll describe their alternative, that the problems that they identify with institutional multiculturalism would be even worse because there would be no way for us to determine what it is that we want out of recognizing difference. To go back to the three original arguments that Christina and Haley made, the first argument was a question of resources. Their argument was that resource competition is made worse by cultural groups, but this frankly seems to be kind of, made up, conflated. Cultural competition between cultural groups or between any extracurricular groups is always going to exist because resources are finite, no matter what kind of institution you are attending. In a pluralistic framework in which we are allowed to have no guiding principles for what it is that we value, it's more likely that competition would intensify. Secondarily, the main critique that Christina and Haley have offered is one that multiculturalism, as it is institutionalized, is exclusionary. That is, that there doesn't recognize certain groups. They give specific examples at Wellesley, but the question is, in the absence of such a framework, would it be more inclusionary? And I think that the answer is no. Pluralism doesn't answer the question of what it is that you do. It doesn't give us a framework, or it doesn't give us an ideological value system in which we can say that there is an intrinsic value to recognizing difference in others, that we should have a deliberative communication in which we can understand both ourselves and the experiences of others in order to broaden our horizons. That is, pluralism provides some value, but to be honest, pluralism isn't all that different from the foundations of multiculturalism. It just kind of leaves out the good part, which is the recognition of difference. Finally, the issue of tokenism and essentialism. I think that there's no real warrant for why multiculturalism, as it is practiced in communities or in colleges today, is inherently essentialist. That is, yes, no single multicultural event is ever going to be able to capture the entirety of the nuances of a particular culture. We will never be able to delve into all of the historical particularities that may inform an identity, but what it does do is it both symbolically and actually does create a space and marks that there is value in understanding that such cultures exist, and that these cultures provide us an alternative viewpoint from which to both criticize ourselves and our beliefs about whether or not some truth claim may be contingent or real, as well as provides a broader awareness of the fact that other individuals may have different understandings of particular events because of their backgrounds. It's unclear to me whether or not institutional multiculturalism is actually detrimental to a liberal arts education, given that the other side concludes that the very fundamental basis of multiculturalism, which is a recognition of difference, is still a positive thing. I think that the better question, or the framing question for this debate, should be, if we do not have institutional multiculturalism, how is it that we actually do begin to celebrate difference, to recognize it, and then to move on to a world in which we're able to create communities of deliberative discourse, that is, where we can each participate as individuals that can recognize our own subjectivity without denying the subjectivity and particular experiences of other individuals.
Thank you. This now concludes the formal debate. I'd like a round of applause for our questions, but first I'm going to explain a few guidelines. As in our last debate, I'm going to first ask that questions be limited only to the topic at hand, that is the question of whether or not institutional multiculturalism is detrimental to a liberal arts education. If we have other topics we'd like to discuss, we can address that as a community at another time. And also, due to limited time, I'm going to ask that if you are selected to ask a question, you first state your name, and then limit your question to 4 or 5 sentences, and somewhere in those 4 or 5 sentences, we need to have a question. I'm not going to allow any kind of speech. I will cut off a speech of that kind. And I will also not allow follow-up questions. So once you've asked your question, please return to your seat or sit down. And then we can move on to another topic. So, and the last thing is that I ask all audience members remain respectful, although I'm not really worried about that. So would anyone in the audience like to ask a question?
Answer that, or should I? It's up to you. So I'll start, and I think Alma will have something to add. I think that a certain degree of marginalization is inevitable merely because there's a limited number or limited resources. I think that the marginalization of certain cultural groups or studies of certain areas is not intrinsic to institutional multiculturalism. In fact, I would argue the opposite, that institutional multiculturalism provides a method by which cultural groups that may have been marginalized in the past now have an opportunity to begin to lobby for a greater awareness or perhaps some kind of critical study of a particular area, that the absence of institutional multiculturalism would in fact make it impossible for such groups to begin to raise awareness or to push an administration to really begin to focus on such an area. That's because in the absence of a college that has an official commitment, let's say, to raising awareness about cross-cultural studies, or has an intrinsic commitment to raising awareness about other groups, that there really isn't a good way for you to justify having these kinds of particular studies. And so unless the institution or administration is really committed to such issues, I think that it'd be much more difficult for a marginalized group to get any representation.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that it's still better to have some department rather than no department at all, right? If there wasn't any such representation for a, quote, marginalized department on campus at all, then none of the students would have the opportunity to learn about that area of the world or learn that language. Yes, it is the reality that many multicultural departments or area studies at this campus in particular, at other campuses, lack funding, or it's slated towards one area of the world or another. But at root, what can happen is a student can go through that program, and maybe if that student is successful in the future, can perhaps give back to that department, or with time it will grow. But in essence, it is better for the liberal arts endeavor to have that department than not at all.
Any other questions from the audience?
Oh, that can't even be true. Come on, guys.
Yes?
Hi, I'm Joy, and a question for Anthony and Christina. In the way that you set up liberal arts education as a process of truth-seeking, doesn't denying multiculturalism imply a single ahistorical truth-seeking, one that's massive privilege, a quest for those who have the luxury not to dwell on cultural and ethnic discrimination?
You want to start?
I'll go first then.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to take issue with your conflation of ahistorical objective search for knowledge and something that smacks of privilege. Traditionally, yes, this is why multicultural programs were instituted, because an objective truth for knowledge sort of implicitly excluded alternative viewpoints, like alternative cultural viewpoints. But inherently, I don't think that an objective truth for knowledge an objective search for knowledge excludes those viewpoints. And so I think historically it might have smacked of privilege, but it doesn't have to as we're looking toward the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Another question?
The idea of forming alliances between groups was mentioned, and I'm wondering what you think about that idea and the idea of one of the purposes of that, in addition to solidifying group identity and understanding where the other group is coming from and what that culture is, forming alliances between groups with the purpose of lobbying for power with different spaces.
What was your name? Lisa. The question of the idea of forming alliances between groups is something that initially we had intended to discuss in my portion. We just sort of ran out of time. Implicit in the idea of some sort of resource struggle is going to be a reluctance to form those sort of alliances between groups. The fact that, Alma acknowledged, perhaps rightly, that wherever you have interest groups, there's going to be a struggle for resources, and our somewhat optimistic, pretty radical alternative sort of envisions a situation in which those sort of identity groups wouldn't be necessary in order to lobby for power. I don't... Do you have anything? Yeah. I imagine that's unsatisfactory to you, and I apologize, but I don't really have any better answer. I mean, again, we're not really in a position to offer decisive policy alternatives. We've only experienced liberal arts education as students and as applicants. We aren't even alumni yet. We clearly haven't been professors. We haven't been staff. We don't know what the real problems of institutionalizing anything are. So it's sort of difficult to say what the alternatives can be.
Other questions? Sure.
Hi, I'm Rachel, and I'm running for the affirmative side. Do you think that there's value at
Sure. Well, I certainly think that there would remain a place for that. I am, and have been actually troubled sort of throughout my 4 years here, watching friends who fall into the categories that give them that sort of institutional support be or feel as though they aren't represented by the organizations that are available to them, feel excluded from those organizations for fairly arbitrary reasons. I've had sort of the uncomfortable, or not uncomfortable, but a little awkward experience of being approached by Mezcla and other organizations because my last name is historically Hispanic and I'm not Hispanic, and it's always an awkward moment when you have to be like, I'm not who you're looking for, but I'm sorry. And I think that those places would exist in a more blatantly plural system. I just worry about the concept of exploring one's individual identity in such a way that it is very, very closely linked with a group identity. I understand the appeal of feeling solidarity or of being able to recognize people who share a common experience with you. I just worry about active individual intellectual engagement being subsumed by a group ideology or by a long history within the institution that, because we're only here for 4 years, we don't really have any way of understanding or of accessing or of even really taking many sort of proactive steps to overcome. Does that make sense? It's kind of meandering. I'm sorry.
Anyone else have another question? Sure.
Well, I don't know if it necessarily reestablishes it or keeps it in place. I think that's what... Right, so correct me if I'm wrong in how I understood your question, but your question was more that if we have institutionalized multiculturalism for any variety of diverse viewpoints, that will serve to just perpetuate that group status, correct?
Just perpetuate the injustice and the exactions before you
Right. That is a lot like what Haley and Christina were saying earlier about fossilization and ossification of identities and structures, but I would wager that if these groups were not in place, then there would be no lobbying power on campus for those groups to gain more resources and to gain more of a voice for themselves. So it's a question of, if this institution didn't exist, if these groups didn't exist, what other avenue would various groups of people have in order to express themselves or gain some sort of power from being marginalized? So there is a risk of, if one does seek refuge only in one's identity or stick with that, instead of exploring shades of gray within that or using the identity to combat a power structure, yes, that's possible, but I would say that more often than not, one can use these organizations and identities to further one's own causes.
Just to add something really quickly, I know an issue that we didn't really address head on but is particularly relevant is that of whether or not identity politics is an effective way to struggle against, let's say, structural racism or sexism or whatever ism it is, type of oppression that you're looking at. I think that your question kind of speaks to a more fundamental question of how it is that we should mobilize against structures of injustice. And I think that given the reality that this debate is limited to college campuses, I think that what the existence of certain groups that are based on, let's say, race, class, gender, sexuality, etc., does is that it provides a kind of a coalescing point for individuals who may experience other identities. That is, you can identify as more than one thing, right? That you may be like, I'm, both Korean and a woman, etc., but that doesn't mean that if I identify with one group politically on campus, that I can't also maintain my other identities. And I think that the ability to mobilize and kind of create coalitions based off of particular parts of your identity is what makes institutional multiculturalism so valuable. Is that, yes, there's always a risk that if you recognize injustice, that in some way you may re-embed it within the system, but the kind of question that comes after that is, what alternative do you have if you have no other strategy to begin to reverse power relations other than to kind of form groups and begin to lobby for some kind of difference, to raise awareness, to begin to create a dialogue about what it means to identify with a particular group? I think that the absence of such a dialogue or the absence of such awareness is worse. The silence, I think, that would fill the silence that would exist, or perhaps the erasure of such identities is far worse in terms of allowing for oppression to continue to exist than perhaps a discussion that might raise some kind of controversy.
So in an institutional multicultural setting, groups are given time and space and access to resources and power and so on and so forth. The problem with that is that that doesn't necessarily entail active participation. You can have a rather small group of people who are very, very actively involved and are representing the interests of a much broader group and aren't actually actively representing those interests. I suppose I may have done rather a poor job of explaining sort of what plurality looks like in the Arendtian sense or in any sort of broader sense, but there's entailed within it is an idea of spontaneity, of a spontaneous gathering together of people with a common interest or united by a common goal to achieve some aim, and then those groups sort of come apart again. Everyone gets back together to discuss, to debate, to really actively engage with various issues without becoming part of these rigid categories. The problem of institutionalization is that it goes on long beyond all of us, or all the time that all of us are here. It has a certain longevity that can be important, but I think that it's important in sort of a more broader political sense. Sort of the unique thing about a liberal arts college is most of us are only here for 4 years. The character of the campus can change radically within a decade. And by institutionalizing very rigid cultural categories and cultural identities, it's not recognizing that sort of basic fact or that basic experience that we all have, that we come and then we go, and we're here for sort of a temporally short amount of our lives, if that makes sense. Does that again, I'm not like Liz, I'm not very good off the cuff.
Thanks, Christina.
More questions?
Sure.
First, I apologize, I'm part of this, I apologize, I was awkward.
Oh, that's okay.
Put it out there.
I also used to be on the mailing list for Harambe House, so.
But never got
Facts.
information, right? Never
I know,
got
right?
to know that we're out there.
It never is.
I want to know how, so we talked about these various pluralisms, and how do you get students to engage in these debates that you ideally see them getting into without these groups being there to facilitate conversations or have things that could spark it? I mean, this is a pretty small turnout. How do you plan on seeing a greater campus come together and spontaneously get together and discuss these things?
Well, the small turnout might be a fact of our failure to publicize, but
The fact that the spam looked like a wanted poster, which is my fault. Sorry, everyone. The way in which sort of Haley's and my alternative is a really radical proposition is that it would entail a big change to campus culture and a big change to the way that the entire system is structured. Sort of what we see now, though, is a system in which there are sort of flare-ups of activism, flare-ups of interest, flare-ups of, students going to Senate or students going to talkbacks or students going to brown bag lunches based on some sort of external threat or change or, economic situation or what have you. And I don't know if that would necessarily change that much, honestly. That people generally have their own set of things that they want to do in a given day. We all have homework and friends and, want to occasionally spend 2 hours over dinner in Tower for no particular reason. A sort of plural system would recognize that, and it would give us opportunities to come together and to talk about big issues, hopefully more frequently than we currently do. Sometimes someone will post something completely random on Community and it will, engender this weeks-long horrible thread flame war thing that just snowballs and, I don't know, goes tumbling down a hill into oblivion. But I mean, it would be sort of a much more active campus culture. It would be a culture with a lot less apathy. It would be a culture in which participation is not necessarily prompted by these, you know, external flare-ups. And I think that overall that would be a positive thing. It could be something, you know, institutionalized pluralism sounds really weird, and it is kind of a weird concept, but it could be something into which, dare I say it, we'd all be indoctrinated, like so many other things, like making a difference in the world. It can happen.
I would like to give preference to someone who has a question for this side, because I've been hearing a lot from over here, so does anyone?
Oh my God, did you just do it?
I have a question for Liz and Alma, but I'd also like to hear Christina and Haley. We've all spoken very theoretically about institutional multiculturalism. Luckily, we have a model that implemented that we're all very familiar with. So could you talk a little bit about, do you really think that Wellesley has been effective in fostering institutional multiculturalism? If so, how, and if not, is it still worth pursuing?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I was hoping somebody would ask that. So, yeah, I think what we've been talking about is mostly ideals up until now and not practical realities. I think the way Wellesley handles multiculturalism is highly problematic on occasion. As we see, we do have all of these different groups that are set up, and then somebody, like just very recently, I'm going to use some very concrete examples. I'm sure you all remember a thread on Community, something involving Israel and involving the conflagration in Gaza. And this just produced a huge flame war, one of these snowballs into oblivion. And it didn't seem to produce anything productive, right? And people sort of went off into their own different cultural organizations without really addressing it face to face, without really dealing with issues. Everyone was hiding behind their computer scenes, classic problem of multiculturalism at Wellesley. However, I know that the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life has been trying, at least, to set up a framework of dealing with this. I know Victor Kanzanjian has been trying to set up a task force with members of Jewish and Israeli supporting organizations, as well as Al-Muslimat and Wellesley Arab Women, in an effort to get at least the negotiating parties to talk about these issues, in the hopes that ultimately this will lead to some sort of productive programming in the future. The problem is, if multiculturalism were not instituted at this level, what else would be there? Without these sorts of task force, whether or not they're effective, to what degree they're effective, I think it would be more likely just that students would flee into their respective cultural organizations without ever coming together, or just hating each other actively behind their computer screens, and never actually addressing issues of multiculturalism. So yeah, there are a lot of logistical problems to be worked out how to institutionalize multiculturalism, but it is still a better ideal than to not have it at all.
I'm just going to chime in really quickly. I think an alternative, yes, this debate was very highly theoretical, and I think that one kind of way to distinguish both sides a little more is to compare what organizations look like now under institutional multiculturalism and what they might look like under institutional pluralism, as the other side has defended. I think that it's difficult to say that institutional multiculturalism has been a success, because honestly, it hasn't been around that long. Frankly, it's an experiment that kind of started in terms of colleges. There really was a lot of discussion about it in the 80s and 90s, because that's when college campuses began to really change in composition, that there was this sudden, quote, loss of community. There was a Carnegie Mellon study done in the 90s about why all the colleges had suddenly lost their community. And the answer was that, well, all of a sudden we've become really diverse, and the original goals and kind of underlying aims of liberal arts education no longer jived with the needs and the particular experiences of the students that were now attending these colleges. I think that given the short time frame that we've had under which to evaluate our attempts at institutional multiculturalism, we can say that thus far it hasn't been as bad as it could have been. I don't think we can say that it's been great. I think that it's going to be very difficult to quantify in any sort of way what a successful institutional multiculturalism program might look like, because frankly we're still discovering what it means to kind of appreciate culture in a way that's non-essentialist, or to appreciate subjectivity as more than just a single identity. I think that the culture shock example, I went to a couple of the culture shock events, and I thought that that was actually a really great idea, that it both provided, you know, the physical space and the opportunity for students to come together, and I think this is something that can distinguish institutional multiculturalism from pluralism, and it's something that I kind of don't really understand from Christina and Haley, is that there's a difference between actively providing opportunities for individuals to come together of diverse backgrounds and to discuss their differences, and not preventing those opportunities from coming about. It seems like a semantic difference, but there is a difference, and I think that that's one of the more fundamental differences between institutional multiculturalism and institutional pluralism. That is that institutional multiculturalism actively attempts to provide for both confrontations as well as just cross-cultural exchanges between groups, whereas pluralism recognizes the difference and doesn't preclude those types of opportunities, but I don't think it actively fosters them either.
Just to respond really briefly, a major difference between our position and their position is that we believe that the problems that Alma mentioned, this sort of sense of an issue comes to head and everyone hides behind their computers and sort of retracts into separate cultural groups, we believe that to be an inherent problem to multiculturalism and not just a failure in implementation. Multiculturalism is an ideology that basically endorses and demands people splitting cultures into separate entities. So it almost demands as a concept that sort of result that Alma mentioned. So that's sort of our response to that. Sure. Briefly. You can say that first.
Oh, no, I don't want to say that first. You go.
We've mentioned this already, but I do think that the reasons that multiculturalism was originally brought about were good. They introduced alternative viewpoints and ideologies into a traditionally Western canon. But it's our position that that framework for addressing culture has become outdated. But I can give it credit that it has introduced that. It did provide the original introduction of those views to a college atmosphere.
Sort of, in addition to being on, mailing lists that don't apply to me, I did actually serve for a year as the atheist representative to the Multi-Faith Council, which was sort of a very interesting position to be in for many, many reasons, most of which I'm sure you're all imagining right now. And it was an experience unlike most others that I've had, simply because I was in a position in which we were explicitly attempting to be a cross-cultural group, and sort of looking around the room. It was last year, so the council, much like the college, the character of the college changes a great deal from year to year as its membership changes. There simply seemed to be groups that were more interested in interfaith dialogue than other groups, which was very striking. We had like 5 Unitarian Universalists and no Catholics. It was very, no offense to Catholics, I'm half Catholic, insofar as you can be half Catholic and an atheist, I guess. I'm very diverse. But I think I agree with Haley in that the original intentions of multiculturalism were good. I think that it's valuable to have more academic opportunities to study minority cultures. I think that Wellesley in some courses does actually do a very good job of pulling together diverse authors. I've taken several political theory courses that in examining sort of the broader idea of liberty, which is generally a pretty Western or a concept that preoccupies Western political philosophers that have also considered the writings of Frantz Fanon, who wrote on the Algerian War for Independence. Marion, I see you burying your head at my pronunciation. I also don't speak French. In any case, I think that there are very interesting ways in which multiculturalism can be beneficial in both inside and outside of the classroom. I just, as Haley established, have some serious problems with implementation. So.
I have a lot of answers to that.
Oh boy.
Did you still want that? Sorry. Was that to me? Oh, were you not done?
Oh no, I'm done.
No, go ahead.
I could meander more.
Sorry. So basically all I study here is multiculturalism, and I have a lot of different experiences related to that. So I major in Middle Eastern studies and French, and basically all I do is study Francophone literature and minority literatures even in North Africa. Like usually I'm studying Jewish literature in Arab North African context. But that ostensibly should mean that I've had my thinking greatly expanded, that I've gained all these different understandings, and intellectually I would say that's true. However, my personal experiences on this campus have led me to really reevaluate how multiculturalism is established. I've had numerous occasions in which, and this is the tokenism that we have been talking about, that I'll be in a class and somebody will say, well, since you're the only Jew in a class, please tell me, like, what is the story of this? Or please tell me, like, what is the Jewish view of this in relation to this other nebulous idea? And all of a sudden I'm put into this spokesperson role for an entire group, and it's a really uncomfortable position to be in. However, I still think it is good that these classes are offered, and I do have the opportunity to learn all of these things, but occasionally people are misguided as to how they single people out or how they personally want to act upon multiculturalism.
I mean, in all honesty, I should probably be sitting on that side of the table, but I think that I'm just saying, I'm not sure I'm really, but for the sake of debate, I think that institutional multiculturalism, I think that Christina and Haley point out a very good critique of multiculturalism, which is that in recognizing difference, in some ways it does force individuals to kind of, I guess, box themselves into a particular culture, and I think that that is always a problem with either self-identification, group identification, or identification of one person of another person. In some ways there's always going to be some kind of limiting factor, that boundaries are always drawn, and that may limit our ability to kind of move and have a fluidity of identities that would be more, that would better foster the kind of discussion that multiculturalism would ideally foster, I guess. I think that multiculturalism, there's kind of this emphasis on tolerance, or at least there was initially, and I think that that's begun to change, and people recognize that tolerance is insufficient, because tolerance is just recognizing that there's difference and saying that, okay, that's not so bad, it doesn't actually affirm or place any value on difference. And I think that one of the problems I do have with the institutionalization of multiculturalism is that it's still unclear to me what exactly it is that multiculturalism is attempting to do. I think that as an ideology, it says that we have to recognize difference. It says that difference has value, and that our particular experiences of the social location that we speak from will determine how it is that we understand the world, and that the ability to communicate to each other these differences is valuable. While I think that's true, I think that it's still kind of unclear to me how it is that we jump from that into a world in which, or how we get from that into an ideal world in which we begin to reduce prejudice or get rid of kind of these stereotypes. And I think it's the kind of gap between those two ideas that I find hard, but yeah.
Okay, so we have time for one more question.
Yeah, well, this issue comes up a lot within Hillel in particular. Oh, sorry, she was talking about again, correct me if I'm wrong in my paraphrasing, but she was saying basically what happens if a student doesn't feel like they are X enough to be considered part of whatever cultural organization they would like to be a part of, that they feel somehow excluded by an apparently homogenized cultural identity. Again, this idea of essentialization or ossification of identities and not feeling like one can participate, someone being on the margins of that identity. So I would say that this is, again, one of those opportunities in which, if this is a source of internal debate for every single organization, I would imagine. I'm part of Hillel, and I know that it's constantly a source of internal debate, how to make people feel welcome and how to combat external perceptions of Hillel and how to reach out to people and make people feel included, that we're not some sort of monolithic organization. So contrary to this idea that we have fossilized ourselves into one sort of homogeneous identity, I would say rather it seems that there is an imposed fossilization from the outside of Hillel's cultural identity, and that's what prevents people from feeling like they can be included, because there's some sort of fear imposed on the outside of what this group is and that that person can't feel included. So I guess it's up to every individual organization to work on how to combat those imposed identities and assumptions and to reach out to people. But without resources from a college, it would be impossible to have that kind of discussion and impossible to reach out to people and provide a variety of programming, like not just religious Hillel programming, but say social Hillel programming also, to appeal to all kinds of different people.